version.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our exit interview with Ambassador Dani Dayan. I'm Jodi Rudoren, Editor-in-Chief of The Forward, and I'm so thrilled to be joined by Andy Silow-Carroll, Editor-in-Chief of The Jewish Week, for an experiment and a partnership between our two organizations to host important interviews and conversations like this one. We've got a huge crowd registered for this event. Obviously, Ambassador Dayan is a huge celebrity, or maybe it's Andy who's a huge celebrity. He's trying to upstage us with news of his own. As many of you probably know, the Jewish Week announced yesterday that it's going to be suspending print operations starting in August. Andy, you want to tell us a little bit about that decision while we wait for people to roll in?
Yeah, the last possible way I would ever wanted to upstage anything. But yeah, we looked at the just our economic realities, and we think we can reach more people and a more diverse audience online. It's very difficult for the staff who won't come with us. It's going to be difficult for the Shabbat reader who depends on the Jewish Week for their Friday night and Saturday morning read. But we think it's kind of inevitable. I know you went through this a couple of years ago, and you could tell better than I what the experience was, but I think it was a sort of an inevitable move, and we have to make the best of it.
Yeah, as you said, the Forward shut down its print operations early last spring, before I came actually as editor. But one of the reasons that I did come after leaving the New York Times was because I understood that I do think the future of great journalism is in digital only, or digital first. And I know that even at the New York Times, with its 1,600 journalists, the only thing that really ever held us back in terms of innovating and being digitally native was the sort of traditions and habits of print and the way that had a hold on the staff. So I think it's hard, it's painful, but I think you're going to find there's so much opportunity, and I think the readers will find that as well. We can get back to that later on in the conversation if people are interested. I see that people have already started to jump into the Q&A, which is a button you'll find probably on the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer, or on the left if you're on a phone or tablet. We are also streaming this conversation live on Facebook. So if you want to share that link with your friends, we'll put it in the chat shortly. If you want to talk to the whole group, you're welcome to post something to the chat. You'll want to do it to all panelists and attendees. If you want to speak directly to me or Andy or Ambassador Dayan, you can just do attendees. But really, if you have a question that you'd like us to bring to Ambassador Dayan, which we'll do towards the end of the hour, you should post it in Q&A. Also, just a couple of little logistical notes. Everybody who signed up for this Zoominar will get in their email a video of the conversation, which we'd be thrilled if you'll share with your friends. And also whatever links we end up posting in the chat, we'll also send to you by email. And you will also be eligible for a special discount subscription to the Forward. So you can look forward to all of that in your email. And I want to just thank Theo Wieseltier, Lisa Lepson, Gabby Brooks, Mira Fox, and Dina Cooperman, who are the incredible team of women behind this event who made this possible, and also the staff of the Israeli Consulate in New York, who helped us out with getting Ambassador Dayan. And I'm sorry for all the filibustering. We just wanted to wait for people. People are still rolling in. So if you've just joined us, I'm Jodi Rudoren from The Forward. We've got Andy Silow-Carroll, my esteemed colleague from the Jewish Week, and we are going to have an exit interview now with Ambassador Dani Dayan, who's about to leave his post after 4 years. An exit interview is usually when somebody's leaving somebody's employ and they finally can tell the bare truth of what's wrong with the organization. So we know you're going to be telling us everything that is wrong with America today.
Jodi, some of the scoops I will leave for my book.
Of course. Ambassador Dayan, you and I first met my very first week when I was posted to Jerusalem as the New York Times bureau chief back in 2012. And one of my early stories was a profile of you as the unusual settler that you were. You were the head of the Yesha Council at the time, and very much not the stereotypical settler. And it was interesting. I was looking back at that piece from 2012, back then in that piece, you had critics from your right and from your left, which became very familiar to me in that role and again in this role, and I'm sure is familiar to you in your current role. So you came here in 2016 after a little controversy of your own, and now you're going back on August 1st. I want to just start, you often say that you came here to explain Israel to America, but you end up spending more of your time explaining America and American Jews back to Israelis. So I want to start by asking you the kitzur. What I love best about this job is using Hebrew on the job, but in short, in brief, like one sentence each, give us 3 things that you learned about American Jews or America overall that you really didn't know before you got here in 2016. And we'll follow up on whatever we need to.
People ask me, Jodi, very frequently what surprised me in New York, and not many things surprised me because I've been to New York 20 or 30 times before I came to serve here. But, I must admit that I am not a very avid shul goer. I wasn't in my previous life a very avid shul goer. And here, obviously, I visited the innumerable shul synagogues. And what surprised me and says a lot, I think it summarizes everything, is the fact that in virtually every synagogue in America, Reform, Conservative, Modern Orthodox, there are 2 flags, the flag of the United States and the flag of Israel. I was pleasantly surprised. It wasn't obvious for me to see that. And I think that it summarizes all the other things. Yes, American Jews are extremely attached to Israel. The second thing that I would say, they know a lot about the issues that Israel deals with. They don't understand the Israelis enough. They know the issues. They fail to understand many times the way we arrive to our positions.
So one thing I noticed, it's obvious, your term maps almost completely onto the Trump era in the United States. The relationship between Israel and the United States, American Jews and Israel, those are 2 different things, but they closely align, has kind of has morphed in that time. How would you describe that relationship? I think a lot of people think it's either strained or broken in some ways. And why do you think that is? And if it is strained, what can repair it?
Well, when I arrived to New York in August 16, the last month of the previous administration, the Obama administration before the election, and then came election night a few months later. And the moment the quite surprising results of the 2016 election were published, they were projected, I knew that immediately that the work of my colleague Ron Dermer in Washington became easier, and my life became more difficult in New York, representing Israel to New York. And indeed, in some sense, that was what happened. I think that the bond between Israel and the American Jewish community is far from being in a crisis. I don't think it is a crisis. But I would say that to the extent that there are strains, I think that the weight that is contributed to what Israel does or does not is overestimated. And the factor of domestic, sociological, socio-political American currents that influence the Jewish community are underrated in the way that is attributed to the strained relations that in some sense do exist. There are things, for instance, that I can only explain in domestic American political terms. For instance, the fact that a certain organization in December 2016, in the last weeks of the Obama administration, did call President Obama to veto the famous anti-settlement resolution in the Security Council of the UN. And on the other hand, a few years later, called on President Trump not to move the embassy to Jerusalem. It's a paradox. I would expect it to be exactly the opposite, to call the president not to veto the anti-settlement, but support Jerusalem. So how do I explain that paradox? The only explanation I have is internal American partisan politics.
Right, but I spoke to Tom Friedman on one of these forums, and he said what he was worried about with annexation, if were to come about, and we've already passed that deadline, the July 1st deadline, that American Jews would have a hard time defending Israel if annexation were to come through. That would be the death knell for the two-state solution. It would be the death knell for basic civil rights for Palestinians. What were you prepared to? It's weird to ask you to defend a hypothetical, but how were you prepared to message that both to the Jewish community and to the wider community?
With great conviction. Basically, it happens a lot with issues related also to settlements, that the perception of them in America, and including in the American Jewish community, also in Europe, is almost metaphysical. It's almost dogmatic. It's detached from the real substance they have. But take for instance the issue of the so-called annexation or extension of Israel's sovereignty over the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, and probably also the Jordan Valley. What does it mean practically? It means basically two things, if it ever happens. It means that Israel makes a clear statement that this is Israel's position in a future negotiation with the Palestinians when they come to the negotiating table, when they cease to be recalcitrantly a rejectionist. But it doesn't mean that it precludes any other thing. Let me remind you, Andy, that Israel did negotiate sovereign territory. Israel negotiated Jerusalem. Israel negotiated the Golan Heights. Israel negotiated the Chalutza dunes in the south of Israel. So it's not like something cataclysmic happened. It's a very strong statement of intent, but no more than that. And the second thing that would happen is that, for instance, my wife works in the Ariel University. The Ariel University was promulgated by a general, by an IDF officer instead of the Minister of Education. That kind of absurdity will cease. And the last remark on that question of annexation, so-called annexation, Levi Eshkol's government, with Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan, and Yigal Allon, and others, annexed areas much more populated than the intention of Prime Minister Netanyahu or Benny Gantz to annex. And actually, the American Jewish community, as far as I remember, I was a child, quite applauded the move of annexing territory. And I think that to this very day, most American Jews applaud retroactively that step of annexing Jerusalem, eastern parts of Jerusalem. So again, it's a lot of politics of perception of who is the person that makes the decision that is involved here, both in America and in Israel.
I want to follow up on that, Ambassador, to ask you, obviously the July 1st deadline passed, but many still expect the Prime Minister to make a move like this. I think your colleague, Ambassador Dayan, said that in an interview published this morning. I want to ask you really specifically, if you were Prime Minister, what would you annex and when? Which parts of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley would you extend Israeli sovereignty over? Would you do it in stages? Would you do it all at once? And what do you think happens after that in terms of many Americans do believe that would be the end of the two-state solution? You're saying maybe not. So what would you do?
Well, Jodi, we had, since we know each other since 2012, we had very extremely candid conversations in which I spoke about virtually everything. And also during my tenure here In New York, we had lunches in which I spoke very candidly. I am a diplomat until August 1st. Diplomats, with all due respect, there is a tendency of diplomats to brag about their importance, even to call themselves His Excellency. But diplomats are not so important. Diplomats do not make policy. Diplomats represent policy. And the government of Israel, I don't advise the government of Israel, even in this prestigious forum that joins the two editors-in-chief of the two prestigious Jewish publications, Forward and Jewish Week, I don't advise my government through Zoom.
Okay, I'll accept that, but I want to go back to something both you and Andy really said, which was, first of all, you said one of your most surprising things, that the first thing was to see all these dual flags in all these synagogues. So I think what you're saying is that at least in the affiliated, organized American Jewish community, you find a strong expression of Zionism, stronger than you might have anticipated from sort of reading the politics from afar. I did a Zoom last week or the week before about annexation, and there was a question from the audience that I found very compelling. I think he was very much part of that American Jewish kind of core. He said, you know, for years as a liberal Zionist, I've been defending opposing BDS and saying that BDS is over the line. But if there's a move to annex or extend Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank, it'll be very hard for me to continue to fight boycott movements. What else, you know, as a liberal Zionist who believes in a two-state solution. So I think this is sort of what Andy was talking about before too, of like, what is a liberal Zionist to do who has been opposing boycotts if there's a move to extend Israeli sovereignty deeper into the West Bank? What do you think
as I said earlier, I really can't understand the logic that brings a person to boycott Israel because of that move. That, again, is not even an unprecedented move. Now, I will tell you, Jodi, I am a huge believer in Jewish peoplehood. For me, Jews are first and foremost a nation, a people. I think you can be a supporter of Israel, be defined as a Zionist, a supporter of Israel, and oppose virtually every single step that the government of Israel does. That's perfectly okay. Exactly as my friend Zehava Galon from Meretz, or Nitzan Horowitz, the leader of Meretz, are staunch Zionists. A similar Jewish American can be a Zionist and still oppose strongly, vehemently, the policies of the government of the State of Israel. But there are a few red lines that the moment you cross them, you break what is, in my eyes, the most basic tenet of Jewish solidarity. Boycotting Israel is one of them. I mean, if you boycott your brother, then because he or she opposes what your brother did, the bond is broken. There is no more bond. I would say in certain senses that also calls that I see in certain parts of the American Jewish community, I think it's not very significant parts, but I don't want to characterize them too much, to cut aid to Israel, or at least to condition aid to Israel, American aid to Israel, to petition your government to cut aid to Israel, is also a break of Jewish solidarity. We are talking about defense aid that saves Jewish lives. The moment you cross that line, you break the most basic tenet of Jewish solidarity. So opposing Israeli policy, the government policy, that's perfectly okay. Actually advocating for steps that put in jeopardy Israeli lives or even Israeli economy, I think that is crosses a red line of Jewish solidarity that is for me very difficult to accept. Exactly like it's very difficult to accept, for instance, for me, Haredim in Israel boycotting or vilifying Reform Jews here in this country because they pray this way and not that way, because they sit together in shul or not sit together in shul. You can oppose that perfectly okay, but to boycott them or to vilify them or to call them names, that crosses, in my view, a line that should not be crossed. You know, I will add something briefly. Sometimes I think that there are American Jews, and by the way, also Israeli Jews, but in this case, we are talking about American Jews, that behave exactly like that bigoted father that throws out of his home the son that went out of the closet. Because he says, if you are an homosexual or if you are not religious enough, go from my home, you are not anymore my son. If we are family, we have a right and even sometimes a duty to talk sincerely to each other. But there are red lines that you do not cross if you feel you are family. If you don't feel you are family, that's a completely different story.
Ambassador, we spoke just briefly before starting here. We talked about Jewish Twitter is all excited by a Peter Beinart piece that's going around, where as a liberal Zionist, I guess he's embracing a one-state solution that would extend, you know, not just sovereignty, but I think citizenship to Arabs and Israelis. For some, that's the end of Zionism. For him, it's the only way to kind of to preserve, you know, a sense of extending rights to the Palestinians if they're not going to get their own sovereign state. And some people cast this as the coming together of a right-wing vision and a left-wing vision of essentially one state for two peoples. Where do you stand on that? And ultimately solutions, do you see a two-state solution as viable? And if not, what replaces it?
No, I don't think that neither I nor my government are one-staters. The fact that we believe that two states at this moment is not feasible and probably is not a solution to the conflict does not mean that we want to commit suicide as a Jewish state and Israel to become a binational state. I would say regarding Peter's article, I met Peter not long ago. We had even two long discussions. I would say that basically what Peter says with quite the chutzpah with the ad is Israel drop dead. And we say, Peter, no, thank you. We have no intention to drop dead. And that's, again, one of the things that crosses a line. His vision, his understanding of Zionism is absurd in my eyes. The claim that Zionism is not about the Jewish state, but about the Jewish home, a cultural home, is so antiquated that, you know, my first thought is how a person that describes himself as a progressive adopts visions that in the 1920s were fashionable probably, but not anymore today. I thought that progressiveness is about innovative ideas, ground trailblazing ideas, and not about absurd ideas that were in some circles mulled 100 years ago, and everybody understood that they are completely antiquated and out of touch with reality.
But even as a thought experiment, I think ultimately what he's asking is about the Palestinians. What is their path to basic civil rights, self-governance, not being citizens of the state in which they live, and how do you see that being involved?
Let me elaborate on that a little bit at length, more than my previous answers. Palestinians could have a state. Palestinians, you know, one of my highlights in New York City was the celebration of the 70th Yom Ha'atzmaut, anniversary of our independence, in a huge event that we did in Times Square. I could have stood in that event with the Palestinian Consul General celebrating our mutual 70th anniversary. If only one thing would have happened, the Palestinians would have said yes to the partition resolution of the UN. But they did said no. And again, from 49 to 67, in 2000, when Barack and Clinton offered the state, in 2008, when Olmert offered a state to Abu Mazen, and on and on and on. So the only reason that there is no Palestinian state is the refusal of the Palestinians, their preference to eradicate the Jewish state, to not to accept an independent state. That means the existence of a Jewish state in what they call Palestine, and we call it Israel, in any part of it. Now, I will tell you the basic thing, why there is no agreement. People think that there is no agreement. In order to achieve an agreement, you have to bridge the differences of opinion on the core issues: settlements, Jerusalem, borders, security, refugees. The moment you bridge on each one of them the differences of opinion, you have an agreement. Wrong. Those are technicalities. There is no peace between Israelis and Palestinians, between Israel and the Palestinians, because we Israelis, most of us, not all of us, but most of us, understood long ago that in the patch of land the size of New Jersey that we call Eretz Israel and they call Palestine, there are two indigenous people: Jews and Palestinians. And the Palestinians still believe that there is only one, and the Jews are colonialists. You don't compromise with the colonialist. So the most important person in the peace process, Andy, is not the President of the United States or the Secretary General of the UN or the Prime Minister of Israel, for sure not, or not even the President of the Palestinian Authority. The most important person in the peace process is the Minister of Education of the Palestinian Authority. The moment that we start to educate that history in its peculiarity created two indigenous people to the same patch of land, and they have to accept that, not just to accept that the other is strong, to accept its legitimacy, because strong, if you accept that the other side is strong, that's good for an armistice. It's not good for a peace agreement. You have to internalize that Jews also have rights. That moment, the moment the Palestinians come to that understanding, the peace process will start. And I will tell you one last thing, whether I will like it or not, the moment, I know the Israelis, the moment the Israelis will feel that the Palestinians accept our legitimacy, you will be shocked, probably I also will be shocked, how forthcoming the Israelis will become in a negotiation, how compromising they will become in a negotiation. What we want, what Israeli wants, is acceptance. And as long as we don't get that from the Palestinians, we don't believe them. And if we don't believe them, and rightly we don't believe them, then there is no basis for an agreement.
I want to stick on this topic for another minute or so, although we have other things to cover. There's a question that Shoshana Gitchow asked that relates to a question Andy and I wanted to ask. What she says is, what about the unaffiliated Jewish youth, ages 20 to 40, who equate the Israeli government with Palestinian oppression, who seem unaware of Palestinian terrorism? This seems to be the liberal attitude among American and American Jewish young people, often based on ignorance. When Andy and I talked about this yesterday, I do think one of the biggest challenges facing American Jewry right now that I hear from both kind of thought leaders and my friends in community is just the divide they see between generations about Israel and how to think about Israel. And they find people are talking about, having difficulty having conversations with their own children and grandchildren. I wonder if you think that, if you can give us your insights about this generational divide, perhaps answer Shoshana's question, what about the unaffiliated Jewish youth? And also, do you think that this commonly reported idea of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on college campuses is actually overblown? I mean, do you feel like you've spent time on college campuses, obviously. You've dealt
Yeah,
with
first of all,
directly.
I spend time in college campuses. Second, I have a daughter in an American college campus in Colombia. She's very active in pro-Israel advocacy as president of Students Supporting Israel. So I am very aware. I must admit that at a certain stage, I had an argument with her. I would tell her, look, it's a generation, it's a question of age. When they will leave campus and go to the real world to pursue a career, to tackle real issues in real life, that will change. And you know what caused me to change that belief that it will change? It's related to your previous workplace. The firing of my good friend James Bennett. When James Bennett was fired,
The op-ed
let's say,
editor of the New York
let's say
Times.
resigned.
Right.
I understood that campus, I don't know, how the campus environment is already out there in many other places. The workplace did not change the campus environment, but the opposite, the campus environment changed the workplace. And it has many implications towards American society future that is an American thing that I would not elaborate on. I think that I hinted to that earlier. I think that, you know, you said intergenerational discrepancies, but it's not only about Israel. It's about many things in America. It's in American that are relevant to Americans. So again, I think that it's not so related to what Israel does or does not. Is much more related to internal American socio-political currents.
So let's pick up on that. In the last couple of months, actually, I want to just do a quick question that someone from the audience asked, which was, did you time your departure so that you would avoid the politics of annexation? Was the question.
No, it's exactly to the day, 4 years from my arrival. I knew a year ago when I was asked if I would like to have a 5th year, and I replied negatively that it was long before the issue of annexation was on the table.
Your successor has not been named?
No, it has not been named yet. I hope it will be a female successor, since, you know, I have the pictures of all my predecessors in my office, and there is only one woman there from 1948 to this day, Coletta Vital, and I think it's time for a second female Israeli Consul General in New York. In the meantime, my very able Deputy Consul General Israel Nitzan will be the acting Consul General.
So I want to talk about you were talking about kind of the political kind of convulsion that the country has been in for the last couple of months since the killing of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and the sort of broad racial reckoning that many Jews and Jewish organizations are deeply steeped in and involved in and talking about. And both Andy and I have published numerous opinion pieces and other things about the intersection between Black Lives Matter and Jews and also Zionism. We all know that in 2016, the Movement for Black Lives had in its platform something about BDS that's not equivalent to the Black Lives Matter movement overall. It also has been removed since then. So there's a live debate over whether there's any conflict between a liberal Zionist view and participation in support of Black Lives Matter. We wonder what your take is on this. Is there any reason why Jews and Zionists shouldn't be fully engaged in the racial justice push and the Black Lives Matter movement?
Again, with that, being very careful not to interfere in American domestic issues, I will say this. I am, even before I came here, but even more so in my 4 years in this country, the issue of African American history is extremely close to my heart. I think I have visited, again, even before I came here, every single place in which Martin Luther King has been, from his birthhouse in Atlanta to his death place in Memphis. And I have been to every single African American history museum in cities I visited. A year ago or so, probably a little longer, my daughter Ophir told me one day, let's take a vacation together, which is a proposal that the father always likes, always loves. And we started to name places, and I told her, you know what, Ophir? Alabama. She said, Alabama? I told her, yes, Alabama. We will do the civil rights trail in Alabama. And we flew to Alabama and visited Selma and Montgomery by car. We didn't march from Selma to Montgomery. The infamous Pettus Bridge and the places in which Rosa, and Birmingham obviously, and the place in which Rosa Parks waited to the for the bus, and et cetera, et cetera. We spent 5 or 6 days. I think it's the most rewarding educational experience this country has to offer. So yes, we have to make, in my view, a huge differentiation between the cause and some of the advocates of the cause. The cause of racial justice in this country is, I think, obviously a just cause, a necessary cause. The fact that some advocates of the cause or some outsiders use the cause in order to foment anti-Israeli hatred is to lament and to oppose and to fight. For instance, the blood libel that Israeli police trained American cops how to subdue protesters with the neck on their with the knee on their neck is exactly that, the blood libel. That the fact that is even promoted by fringe Jewish groups is even more infuriating. But yes, we have to make that clear differentiation between the cause and those that use the cause in order to incite against Israel. It's very clear for me. I have no contradiction here inside my art.
Ambassador, I know not everybody might be familiar with your background, that you were born in Argentina, is that right? Someone asks in our Q&A, to what extent were you able to draw upon your Spanish fluency during your tenure in New York? And I guess that's a question about Hispanic-Jewish relations.
I think that it was one of my most important tools here in New York. When I came to New York, I had to make a decision. The first decision I had to make is, I had to make 2 decisions. I made the first one very quickly, that I didn't come to New York to preach to the choir. Meaning I could start my morning with an Orthodox community and then go to an evangelical temple and finish my day with a Tea Party rally and get 3 standing ovations, but at the end of the day, I did nothing. So I instructed my staff that I want exactly the opposite, to go to those that don't hate Israel, but still need convincing. And the second decision is what those audiences are. And goes without saying that I invested a lot in the Jewish community. That's for sure was my top priority, but ethnically speaking, I selected the Hispanic, the Latino community as my top priority, because not because of my Spanish, but because of the fact that it's the fastest growing, is still less prejudges Israel and Zionism than other communities, and it's essential for the future of the relations of Israel with the American society. If we do not have strongholds in the Latino community, we start working that now. in 30, 40 years, when Latinos will be 30% of the American electorate, it will be too late. So yes, I made a lot of inroads into the Latino leadership in New York and the other areas I cover. Yesterday, my good friend, the president of the borough of the Bronx, Ruben Diaz Jr., surprised me by calling yesterday Dani Dayan Day in the Bronx. So if you have a parking ticket from yesterday in the Bronx, call me, I will cancel it. But if you didn't wear a mask, I will not. And I visited, I think, 5 times official visits to Puerto Rico, especially after the Hurricane Maria. And it had, that's not the reason why I did it, but it had a huge resonance in the Latino community, the Puerto Rican community, the Dominican community in New York. Mm-hmm. And the Spanish obviously helped.
Ambassador, there are a ton of questions from the audience that we want to get to, and many of them are on the topic of annexation or extending Israeli sovereignty to the West Bank and the future of the two-state solution or the future of the conflict. So I just want to run through a few of them and give you another shot at that, because there are a few parts of this that you haven't quite drilled into. So Marilyn Grossman says, is there any realistic way to have 2 states after what is proposed as the annexation? If not, what becomes of the Palestinians and how do they not become second-class citizens, creating an apartheid situation? Then we also have, I'm just scrolling through here, George Stern notes that you had said earlier in the interview that you don't compromise with colonialists. Isn't annexation just more proof that Israel is colonialist? And our colleague Rob Eshman invites you to answer Andy's excellent question earlier about what the future of Palestinian civil rights would be under annexation. So I think we really want to hear you on your vision of, you believe Israeli sovereignty should be extended to the settlements in the West Bank. What is the right way to treat, how should Palestinians be treated under some plan like that? And not just today, tomorrow, next week, but what is this forebode for the future resolution of the conflict? If there's no hope for a 2-state solution right now, are you still holding hope for the future? How does Israel avoid, in expanding its territory, becoming an apartheid state?
Well, first, when I said that the Palestinians look at us as colonialists, and probably also the gentleman that asked the question, I meant, what is a colonialist? The colonialist is the foreigner that comes to colonize a territory that he has no attachment to. The French were colonialists in Algiers. The British were colonialists in India. If you think that Jews are colonialists in any part of Eretz Israel, so we have a completely different debate. Basically, we don't have common ground to that debate, because for me, it's inexplicable how you can feel so. But so no, Jews cannot be colonialists in any part of Eretz Israel. By the way, like Palestinians can be colonialists in
right. So both peoples have claims to this land.
Exactly. So that's,
what do we do with the Palestinian
take the word colonialist out of the vocabulary in this conflict. Look, Jodi, I am a person that tried, and I think quite successfully, to live my life, personal life, business life, public life, and diplomatic life by high moral standards. I think that one of the sentences in your profile that you wrote about me in the New York Times that created the most turmoil was that you quoted me. I showed you a mask, an African mask in my living room, and I told you that I bought it in South Africa, in post-apartheid South Africa, because I never visited South Africa during the apartheid days. And no, it wasn't a coincidence that I didn't visit before, only after. My conscience towards the Palestinians is clean. That doesn't mean that Israel did not commit injustices. every country, every state, for sure in a 100 years conflict, does its share of injustices. You know what? It also does its share of stupidities. But if I look at the picture, at the big picture, my conscience toward the Palestinians is clean. If there is one stable pattern in the political side and diplomatic side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is that every single time that the two-state solution or partition was offered, we accepted it, then they rejected it. So that is the only reason there is no Palestinian state, and the Palestinians, yes, are in an unpleasant situation. I agree to that. I will be the last person to deny it, but I can't bear that responsibility of my shoulders. The rejectionism is, I can't force them to not, I mean, they have to make the decision to cease being a rejectionist, to abandon the desire to annihilate Israel, to flood Israel with Palestinian citizens, etc., etc. So again, the moment they will come to that conclusion, again, you will be surprised how forthcoming and how compromising Israelis will become. Until that day, you know, I refer you and the others to an article that I published in the New York Times in my when I was a free citizen and not a representative of only of my government. It was called Peaceful Non-Reconciliation Now. And the gist of it was that unfortunately reconciliation between Israel and Palestinian is still far because of the Palestinian positions. But we have to find a way to live a normal and free life for all of us until an agreement is reached. Which agreement ultimately will be reached? I don't know. For sure, not the one state, which is Israel ceases to exist as a Jewish state. Two states, it will need the Palestinians to change their attitude. Probably, you know, we have to think out of the box. We have a peculiar conflict that probably needs a peculiar solution. That we need a diplomacy engineer or diplomacy architect that will come with an out-of-the-box structure for Israelis and Palestinians that will provide the basic needs and aspirations of each one.
So we have about 10 or so minutes left, maybe 15, and we have numerous excellent questions from our audience. So I want to get to them. Joel Leiden asked a couple questions, versions of the same. The big question is, how do you explain Trump to Israelis? And he then expands on that. Let me see if I can find the expansion. There are lots of questions here. I'm scrolling, I'm looking. Basically talked about, he says, Trump wanted to pull US troops out of Syria. He advocates a Palestinian state. And today he is now using Nazi symbols in his re-election campaign. He bashes the FBI, CIA, NSA, and NATO. He wants to take away health. He has a very, Trump bashing list of criticisms of the president, describes coronavirus as a hoax. And he said, what Joel Leiden says is that, but Israelis seem to only know that he moved the embassy to Jerusalem and hear him say over and over again that he's Israel's best friend. So he asks, while Trump divides the US, so he wants to know, are Israelis aware of the full picture of Trump and engaged in that? Do you need to, how do you explain him to them? Does it?
And Jodi, if I may, maybe and just expand that to talk about kind of the growing partisan gap over Israel. I think bipartisanship is always a foundation stone of Jewish advocacy for Israel. And
so there are two questions that are interrelated, but I would like to answer both. The first answer is, of course, Israelis read newspapers and websites and know exactly what happens, or at least in general terms, what happens in this country. It's not my task to explain American politics to Israelis. you were right in your introduction saying that I in some sense, I am a bi-directional ambassador in the sense that I see myself as an ambassador of Israel to the United States, to large areas of the United States, and also an ambassador of the Jewish community of the United States to Israel, because for me, the Jewish community is not a foreign country. But the United States in general is not, I'm one directional. I only represent Israel to America. I don't represent America to Israel. You know, it will be in some senses weird to expect from Israelis to judge an American president on his positions on domestic American issues. Yeah, it's quite natural that Israel is as interested first and foremost in his policies towards Israel. I think it's quite I don't know, quite weird to expect Israelis to judge an American, a Brazilian, or a Portuguese leader according to, as long as, of course, some red lines are not crossed. But yes, Israelis are mainly interested in the positions of the President of the United States, any President of the United States, regarding Israel. Now, I am a strong believer in the need of Israel to be bipartisan. I am probably one of those naive persons that really believes that Israel has to be bipartisan. There are those that pay lip service to bipartisanship. I do believe in bipartisanship. For every Republican I met at least 5 or 6 Democrats. Yeah, I'm worried but by some things that happen in the liberal wing of American politics. In general, I think that the fact that the political discourse in this country is being taken over by the extremes and the mainstream sometimes seems quite clueless is an issue that should concern also Americans, not also only an Israeli diplomat, but again, I'm crossing lines here. Now I'll tell you, it's difficult to maintain Israel as bipartisan in American politics, but only part of the blame is on Israel. Nothing is any more bipartisan in America, nothing. Abortion is partisan, and gun control is partisan, and tax cuts are partisan, and health insurance for sure is partisan. And lately, you know, it seems like a joke, but even the weather became partisan. There is a party that believes in global warming, a party that doesn't believe in global warming. Sometimes I joke if it's too hot.
I hear that though, but there's a difference. I mean, recognizing that reality and on Israel's part leaning into it are two different things. So if Israel is signaling to one party or the other that, you know, you're our guys, doesn't that change the?
No, look, Israel has a strategy. Israel has a strategy to be as close as possible to any American administration. Mm-hmm. I am positive that if Secretary Clinton would have been elected President of the United States, Israel would have made any possible effort in order to be as intimate as possible with the Clinton administration. Now, it's true that you need two to tango. When an American president goes to Cairo and skips Jerusalem in his first months of his administration, that is a very strong signal that he wants to keep us at arm's length. On the other hand, when an American president in his first visit abroad visits Jerusalem, he signals that he wants an intimate relationship. So it's not the strategy of Israel, the interest of Israel, the vital interest of Israel to be as close as possible with any administration does not, and will not change.
So we have a question from someone named Elihu Davison, he made the comment that Ron Dermer has been described as the ambassador to the Republican Party, which, you know, fits with what you just said in a way of Israel's necessity or strategy to focus on the administration at hand. But how do you expect...
I think that Ambassador Dermer was an excellent ambassador is an excellent ambassador to the United States.
His question, Elihu's, was about would you expect Israel's approach to change if Joe Biden were elected?
Well, you know, Joe Biden is a friend of Israel. He visited Israel innumerable times. We understand that probably will be a change in some policies. I will, without entering, you know, when I came to New York, Prime Minister Netanyahu gave me only one instruction. He told me, even when you are asleep, don't mention the names Trump and Clinton, Hillary Clinton. So I will not enter into names.
Okay, let's move on because we don't have a lot of time.
I can say that one of the things that interests us most as a result of political American processes is the issue of Iran. We believe strongly that return to the JCPOA as it is will be a huge mistake by any American administration, and definitely this is an issue that concerns us.
So there's again a number of great questions here, and I do have one last question I want to ask myself. So I'm going to ask you to quickly answer two good ones from the audience whose names I've now lost, but you're asked, what was the most difficult moment for you during your 4-year tenure? And what are you leaving unresolved as you leave? It's hard to answer those in short, I think, but if you could try.
Okay, I think that unfortunately the most difficult moment has no competition, that's Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh shooting. From all places, it found me in Phoenix, Arizona, in a national conference of the JNF, and due to the time difference in the early hours of the morning, I started to get reports. Pennsylvania is in my jurisdiction. I immediately flew to Pittsburgh. I arrived to Tree of Life Shul at midnight. A terrible experience. The bodies were still lying inside the Tree of Life synagogue. And I stayed in Pittsburgh for an entire week, for the entire Shiva week with the funerals, and we brought the Israeli Trauma Coalition. I paid the Shiva visits to all the families and embraced the Jewish community as much as I could. Pittsburgh that day became from one more city in the area I cover to this city in the area I cover. And it's still that probably, as with all the difficulties now with the COVID, I expect to visit Pittsburgh once more before I leave. Unresolved, millennials. Millennials, I define the millennials as one of my top priorities, and I'm not sure I cracked the millennial enigma, how to communicate with them. Thank God I have excellent millennials in my staff, so they took command on that matter. I don't feel contrary, for instance, to the Latino community or even to American liberals, that I think I found a way not to solve all problems, but to communicate positively and to make inroads. I don't feel I had the same success with the younger generation, probably because of my age. Probably my successor needs to be not only a female, but also much younger than me.
I really think we should consider your daughter as a candidate. That would also resolve her visa issue for the continuing at Columbia. So, Andy, before we go, someone is asking, will the New Jersey Jewish News remain in print? So, is that a question you can answer?
I can say that we are on hiatus and everything is a possibility. Right now we're leaning into digital first, and we hope to, we're exploring all possibilities right now, but we are on hiatus.
Great.
As a print product.
So both.
We are, no, I mean,
New Jersey and, yeah, okay.
New Jersey they asked about. Oh, I'm sorry, New Jersey.
Sorry, New Jersey is what they asked about.
That's the question. That's unresolved just yet. And so please tune in. We'll get you an answer to that as soon as we can.
I neglected to mention, by the way, that both Andy and I are at home at our homes in New Jersey, and that while you are called the Consul General of New York, of course, you are also the Consul General for New Jersey, right? So,
and we have, I really, the relations with New Jersey in the last 2 years were greatly strengthened. I was in Israel with the governor. The governor enhanced the New Jersey Israel Commission. The relations with New Jersey are flourishing.
So I know people are leaving to go to their next Zoom or lunch or whatever, or breakfast out on the West Coast or whatever in Israel. But I want to thank everybody again for joining us. Thank Andy Silow-Carroll so much for joining me for this interview, and we'll be in touch soon about our next joint events. You will receive in your email a video of this conversation and some summaries and some of these links. But I want to thank again those who made this possible. Thea Weasel here from the Jewish Week, and on our forward staff, Mira Fox, who's literally running the Zoom right now, as well as Dina, Gabby, and Lisa, who helped work behind the scenes to make it possible. Thank you also to Tali and Almog at the consulate for helping us arrange the interview with Dani Dayan.
My millennials.
I want
Tali and Almog, and part of my millennials.
Yes, exactly. So one of my favorite quotes from any Israeli is from Ariel Sharon, the late Ariel Sharon, who said when he became prime minister, what you see from here, you don't see from there. He had, of course, been defense minister and many other positions and thought he knew kind of everything about the situation. And yet when you get into that office, he said, it doesn't look the same. And I have had that experience myself as I have moved from reporter to editor or whatever, parent. And I wanted to put that question to you. Specifically, what you lived in Israel, you were an activist in Israel and knew so much about your own country. Now you've spent 4 years looking at your country from afar. And I wonder what you have seen from here, from New York, about Israel that you didn't see before. What have you learned about your own home?
I must be sincere. I hated that quote from Ariel Sharon then, and I hate it now. I think that is a pretext. I think that the person that is involved doesn't need the change of positions to understand things. And look, I still am extremely proud of my country. Also from here, I am terribly homesick. And I am glad I am returning to Israel. The only solid knowledge I know about my future is that I'm going to 14 days of quarantine. All other things are open. And, you know, all the good things in my life happened surprisingly, including my nomination to this position that I think is the most interesting and exciting position in Israel's foreign service. So I will see what my country has for me and what the future has for me. One thing I can tell you, yes. You know, I entered public life some 13 years ago after a business career, mainly as a one-issue person. I returned from here in that sense different. I became extremely committed to the Israel-World Jewry relationship. And it's really captivated me. I think Israel needs to change course in that respect. Not only the government, also the Israeli public, the Israeli society has to become much more interested, much more involved in that. And I am sure that whatever I will do professionally or daily, that will be an issue I will remain involved.
Well, if you run for prime minister, we will have you back to interview you again. And we look forward to that conversation and look forward to seeing what you do or to hearing about how quarantine is once you get there. So have a good last few weeks in America. And we will miss you. We appreciate how open you've been with us, with journalists in general. And we look forward to continuing the conversation wherever you may be and whatever your job may be.
Thank you so much. Toda rabba.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you to Jodi.